I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I'm your host, Connor Rebush, fight analyst extraordinaire. And even though I didn't confidently pick Rafael dos Anjos last week on either the Bloody Elbow Vivisection or on this podcast, one of the few people who seem to have given Rafael dos Anjos the chance that he now very apparently deserved. With me, of course, is Patrick Wyman, who famously, infamously now, picked against Rafael dos Anjos, really just stood in his way, said he would never amount to anything. You know, he came from the bottom, Pat said, and he's destined to stay there. Pat, how do you explain that kind of attitude?
How do I explain that?
Yeah.
You say that like I didn't scout Donald Cerrone for the man himself. About coming up on 2 years ago now.
Well, what do you have to say for yourself is a better way to phrase it.
What do I have to say for myself?
How do you sleep at night?
How do I sleep at night? With great ease. I sleep like a baby. No, this was, I think this was just an incredible performance from Rafael dos Anjos. And, it was, I think to both of our credit, I would say, even if we didn't correctly pick the winner, we both correctly identified the dynamic of the fight.
Yes.
What were going to be the key things, and we will is something that we'll come back to a little bit later.
And I think that last week we had an episode dedicated to Anthony Pettis and outfighters. I think we can pretty proudly say that everything we identified as a habit of Anthony Pettis, all of the aspects we identified as being integral to his style of fighting, really did make themselves evident in this fight. The confidence issues endemic to outfighters, which some people I think balked at. My armchair psychology saying that Anthony Pettis, his smug attitude kind of hides a deeper insecurity. People said, how can you say that? And obviously it's inference. It's not, I don't know the man personally, but just based on what we've seen from outfighters, these are the kinds of analytical keys it's fun to pick up on, and I think that those thoughts were vindicated in the fight. Would you agree?
I really would. I think that there's a very great deal to take from this fight in terms of what people had identified beforehand, and in terms of the stylistic archetype to which Anthony Pettis belongs, and the matchup between the kind of archetypal pressure fighter in Dos Anjos and the archetypal outfighter in Pettis. There's a lot to take from this matchup. There's a lot to take from the matchup of Joanna and Carla Esparza too. A boxer puncher in Jędrzejczyk versus another outfighter in Esparza who just could never get her game going.
Yep, absolutely. So we'll be talking about both of those fights for those who aren't familiar, or for those of you who are for some reason listening to this show having very little knowledge of MMA and combat sports in general. This last weekend, Saturday, March 14th, was it?
It was the 14th.
Saturday, March 14th. Rafael dos Anjos, inexplicable number one contender who just lost to the man who should have been the number one ranked fighter in the division a year ago, Khabib Nurmagomedov, still a very good fighter, and he proved that by taking on Anthony Pettis, lightweight champion, dominated him from round to round, bell to bell, and won every single round on every single judge's scorecard, and became the new lightweight champion. How long that will last, nobody really knows. If he's going to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov next, he may suffer a similar defeat, or we may in fact be seeing a new and revitalized version of Mr. Dos Anjos. But before we get into the particulars of that fight, Pat and I are going to go back to the heavy bag. We didn't have time to answer a question last week, but this week we are. We're going delving into the heavy bag. You know what we need, Pat, is like a sound effect of like a glove hitting leather and like a rattling chain. We need the sound of a heavy bag being struck.
We really do.
Yeah,
I think that's what this show is missing. A little flash, Connor. A little
sound.
Flash.
That's what it's missing. Also, a respectful co-host.
Well,
you can submit your ideas to me in email form like everyone else, Pat. Okay, this is. We need a soundboard. We're doing well, guys. This relationship is working. Our question this week comes to us from a man mysteriously identified only as TG, who sent an email to the show's email address, which is connor@heavyhandspodcast.com. By the way, before we forget, if you have questions you want answered next week, we're always reading through our backlog of questions looking for good ones. You have to tag them with #HeavyBagQuestions on Twitter to make sure that we see them and they don't get lost. And even if we don't answer them this week, we'll always be looking back and keeping our eye on good ones. So any questions you have for the show, please send them to us. TG says, upsets have a tendency to seem almost obvious in retrospect. In the time you guys have been following the sport, are there any upsets that buck this trend, or do all upsets follow a kind of logic that is only illuminated after the fact? The closest thing I can think of is GSP Sarah. So I think that's a fantastic question, particularly in light of the upset we just experienced, seeming one that was so unexpected, and yet looking back at it, I think anyone with an analytical eye can say, okay, yeah, I can definitely see why that happened. So what do you think, Pat? Any upsets that come to mind that buck that trend that don't seem obvious in retrospect?
The big one that comes to mind for me, and this wasn't a huge upset. I think that the favorite in this fight was it was somewhere between -180 and -200, so about 2-1. Diaz Condit, simply because Condit's performance was so unbelievably against type. He had never done anything to make us think that he was capable of executing a game plan like that for 5 rounds. Mm-hmm. Like, there was literally nothing that you could have looked at in his body of work to make you think that he was going to be able to stick and move for 5 rounds in the face of really intense pressure without, at some point, reverting to his usual self, biting down on his mouthpiece and throwing.
I think it's a great one.
That's the one that really comes to mind for me, is like, wow, I just had no idea that he was capable of doing that. Most of them, I think, really do follow that logic, that you can see it after the fact. Also, Tim Boetsch versus Yushin Okami, I think was really pretty unexpected. I don't know that you could have seen that one coming.
Or even Tim Boetsch versus
Brad Tavares.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Every one of Tim Boetsch's upsets are. I mean, it's predictable only in that Tim Boetsch has a thing for upsets.
Yeah, I mean, he's a big puncher, you know, but not a particularly consistent one, and not one who does a whole lot to make his shots land with any sort of regularity. So it's like lightning striking, and you know that lightning can strike, but predicting that it's going to is never really makes sense.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What comes to mind for you?
Well, I'm struggling to come up with MMA examples. The only one that kind of comes to mind is not really an upset, because the guy delivering the unexpected punishment didn't win, but that was Johnny Hendricks versus George St. Pierre, and even then, I can kind of see in retrospect how Hendricks handled GSP, and that fight I think had more to do with all of us expecting consistency from GSP, one of the most consistent fighters in the sport. You know, he's always delivering the same level of excellence, and then just starting to see for the first time the really marked signs of decline. When, if you look back, you can actually see some of those signs in the Condit and Nick Diaz fights as well. So even that one is able to be, you know, looking at it analytically, you can kind of understand it after the fact. But two that stand out to me that really play into that idea of Tim Boetsch being a puncher, you know, having that kind of power just sort of makes you a built-in comeback machine. You know what I mean? You may get the comeback win at any moment. And I think that is true of current middleweight boxer Andy Lee. I don't know if anybody watches who listens to the show has seen Andy Lee, but he's not a bad boxer. He was trained by Emmanuel Stewart, so that's obviously something good going for him. Guy who trained Vladimir Klitschko, Lennox Lewis, Thomas Hearns, among many others. And in Andy's last 2 fights, he has gotten his ass whooped and then knocked somebody out with 1 punch. And that's not really the kind of thing you can ever predict. I mean, I guess it looks obvious in retrospect because you say, yes, it may have happened, but it's very difficult to look at and say why it happened other than just he hit him really hard and then the other guy stopped being conscious.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that was, speaking of that was kind of the dynamic in the Overeem Nelson fight from this weekend. Like, a lot of people were predicting Nelson by first round KO on the basis of that power. And this is true of predicting, Nelson wins in any fight, is like, yeah, the dude hits really hard, but his process is totally shot, and you can never be confident in picking Nelson by knockout against a fighter who has kind of a better built-in process than he does.
Picking Roy Nelson, I mean, that may have been the most difficult to predict fight ever for me. Because I can't rely on either guy. I can't rely on Roy Nelson to do well, and I can't rely on Alistair Overeem to take a single punch. Or to be, like, neither of them are consistent for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, and so there are some guys where that dynamic comes out very clearly. I mean, but then, you know, there are some, like, what was an upset that you picked, Connor, that seemed really obvious to you in foresight that for whatever reason other people weren't seeing? Like, can you come up with any like that?
I didn't pick him to win, but it seemed really obvious to me that TJ Dillashaw would be a really tough fight for Renan Barão. And that was one that actually people laughed at. I did a Gaps in the Armor piece for that one as well. Talked about how Dillashaw needed to touch and turn Barão, needed to take advantage of his static footwork, needed to keep him, needed to also, as I've pointed out, and it seems almost all of my most successful Gaps in the Armor pieces on Bloody Elbow, that he needed to exchange kicks with him. But I did think he had a solid shot, and everybody, I think, was so high on this idea of Renan Barão as a absolute world beater, this dominant pound for pound force, that they didn't actually take a look at what made TJ Dillashaw so good and why it was such a challenging style matchup for Barão. And in that fight, I kind of picked it based on, almost the same reason I just picked Anthony Pettis over Dos Anjos last week. You can't. It's almost like you'd feel ashamed of picking the upset. You're like, well, I can't really pick against the champion. I mean, he's such a good finisher, and at some point he's going to find it. It's like picking against somebody like Anderson Silva. Like, even if he loses the whole fight, he's still going to hit you with that Chaelsohn and triangle in the 5th round. It feels like it's an inevitability. And with Barão at the time, it did feel like that. So, yeah. But I definitely thought that Dillashaw would bring it to him. What about you, Pat? You have an example of that?
For me, it was the first fight between Anthony Pettis and Benson Henderson. Pettis came in as about a 2-1 underdog. That was this was the first fight where I ever really sat down and did research before the fight and really tried to come up with a prediction. And everything that I saw to me said that Pettis was going to win that fight. And I felt the same way the second time they fought too. I picked Pettis to win that one as well. I just thought that everything that Benson Henderson relied on to do well. I mean, I didn't have a term for it at the time, but I knew that Benson liked to fight on the outside, and Pettis did too. And I thought that Pettis was a better out fighter, and also that Benson relied really heavily on his ability to scramble. And I thought that Pettis could scramble with him all day. So those were those two to me. Where I just thought that no matter what the betting odds said, no matter how it lined up, I just thought that the stylistic matchup really pointed heavily in favor of Pettis.
I will say I had a good one this week, a good underdog pick that I felt really confident in, which was I picked Beneil Dariush over Darren Cruikshank.
Yeah, I was on that as well.
A fight that I described as the bootleg version of Rafael dos Anjos Pettis, and it happened to play out that way almost exactly. Yeah, both fights were really very similar.
Yeah, I mean, I had the pleasure of watching Benny Dariush do some training down at King's back in December, and he is a very, very special fighter.
Yes.
Because he's so cerebral. He's really, really smart, and I don't just mean MMA smart. He is a legitimately smart person, and you can see that in his approach. I saw him at the end of the training session giving Fabricio Verdum pointers on how to finish a particular variation of a deep half guard sweep. And so Verdum is a multiple-time ADCC champion and one of the very best jiu-jitsu practitioners in the history of mixed martial arts and the history of jiu-jitsu for that matter. And if you have things that you can show Fabricio Verdum from a technical perspective with regard to jiu-jitsu, you're a sharp dude. You know things. You know?
And Verdum is listening. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of came through. Great. That came through in the fight, because one of the things I look for to really see how high level a guy's jiu-jitsu is how quickly do people tap to his submissions. And when Beneil Dariush put that rear naked choke on Darren Cruikshank tapped before it even looked like it was locked in. Just like Jacare Ronaldo Souza choking out, was it
Chris Camozzi?
Chris Camozzi.
Triangle.
He put him in an arm triangle, and Camozzi went unconscious on his way to tapping out. Yeah, that immediate confidence and pressure in the submission.
That was the quickest okay, I'm fine to, oh, I'm completely unconscious thing I think I've ever seen in MMA, because it was like 3 seconds.
Yeah.
It was insane.
It was insane. It was terrifying. Okay, well, on the subject of upsets, obviously we have that big one we've just discussed tangentially to discuss this week. And, of course, today we are breaking down Anthony Pettis versus Rafael dos Anjos. I think we will go to a break. That way we can have a nice, long, interrupted discussion of that main event. And then after that, we're going to move on to Joanna Jędrzejczyk versus Carla Esparza, maybe Sergey Kovalev versus Jean Pascal. If we have a little time, we can get reflect a little bit on our archetypes discussion. And I want to point out that I like that upsets question so much because last week and the week before in our 2 installments of our Styles Make Fight series, Pat and I both talked about how useful these archetypes are: the outfighter, pressure fighter, counter fighter, brawler, boxer, puncher, and potentially all-terrain fighter, potentially brawler too. We have those iffy ones, but we talked about how useful they are as not only analytical tools, but predictive ones. And so we can maybe kind of look back and see how we may have predicted Anthony Pettis versus Rafael dos Anjos better using our nice, simple, categorical fighter archetypes. So we will come back to that after this break. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials, but if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us, and like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. Okay, and we are back. As I said before the break, we're going to be talking about Anthony Pettis versus Rafael dos Anjos. Pat, before the break, we talked about upsets and how they all look clear in retrospect. I think that holds true with this one. You know, as big a difference as there seemed in the prestige of Rafael dos Anjos and Anthony Pettis before the fight, looking back, does it almost kind of feel like we should have seen this coming?
See, I don't necessarily think so. I think that pretty consistently when you were looking at when you were looking around the community of analysts around the web over the last week, I think everybody pretty much hit on the dynamic of what that fight was going to look like. I think we got into it really well with our discussion of archetypes when we defined this as a battle for space and a battle for where those two for where the fight was going to take place.
Yeah.
Because Rafael dos Anjos, archetypal pressure fighter, he wants to push you backwards so that you're close to the fence. He wants to take away your space. He wants to take away your angles, take away your movement. Anthony Pettis is the archetypal outfighter. He wants to be as close to the middle of the cage as humanly possible, or best case scenario, have you backed up to the cage so that he has all the space in the world to operate and move. Like, you look at the iconic moments of Anthony Pettis' career, the Showtime kick, the Showtime knee that he hit on Donald Cerrone. Those iconic moments came when he was pushing his opponent back, because what did that give him? That gave him all the space in the world to move freely. Like, you know, you want to be an open space if you're an outfighter. A pressure fighter wants to take away your open space. That was the basic dynamic of this matchup, was who was going to win that battle.
Pat, I think you hit on something really interesting there when you mentioned that outfighters, or that Pettis thrives when he's able to push somebody back, because I think we correctly identified his archetype as an outfighter, but maybe not necessarily where his strengths as an outfighter may lie, or at least I didn't have these things in mind, because most outfighters tend to be really good at escaping back to their open range, you know, back to that open space where they can get their distance, they can move around freely, they can create their angles, and they can set up their strikes. They rely on the escape, and they do it very well. And Pettis is not a very good escape artist. He, in order to have his room, he almost has to push his opponent back. He has to go through them to get himself back to his space of comfort. And I think that really showed against Dos Anjos, because not only was Dos Anjos happy to almost even just let himself be hit at times and just refuse to take much of a backward step, or refuse to step back more than 1 or 2 steps before immediately coming forward again, but he was circling with Pettis masterfully. So it really kind of revealed how limited Pettis might be in that area of that small, tight, small steps, pivots, subtle footwork that allows you to get away from a guy who was working that consistently to cut you off.
Yeah, and I think again, to keep with the hitting on something important field, you mentioned in there that Pettis really seemed to struggle with his small movements, his short steps, his ability to change up the directionality of his movement on a dime in order to escape and in order to get back to open space. To the extent that this was something that really became clear, I think, in the exchanges. And the exchanges, to me, were the heart of this fight. They were where Dos Anjos won the fight and where Pettis lost it.
Yeah.
Where Pettis is almost unconcerned with where he is relative to his opponent in terms of foot positioning and angles. The high kick that he hit on Joe Lozon, to use one example, came from inside foot position, and that is in an open guard matchup. He had his lead foot inside of Lozon's, and that's a really strange place to land a fight-ending high kick from. You don't see that very often. Usually it comes from the dominant angle, because from the dominant angle, it's much harder to see the high kick coming. Mm-hmm. It's just the way that your line of sight works and the way that your peripheral vision works. It's much harder to see the kick from that angle. So I think that Pettis a lot of the time is really unconcerned with where his feet are. And that really came back to bite him, because Dos Anjos was always looking for the dominant angle in this matchup. Pettis fought exclusively in orthodox here.
Yeah, and I don't know if I necessarily agree that he's unconcerned, but it's almost like Pettis doesn't have to be concerned as much. We talked before we started recording about how good he is at adjusting his strikes, whether they're punches or kicks, mid path or mid trajectory, to adjust and find the target. And so he can kick from very close or very far away, or from an outside or inside angle, and make that high kick find the target, because he adjusts the way he throws it before it lands. And I think that I think he definitely knows, how to stand to get those strikes home, but it's almost like he's so good at doing it from any of those positions that it doesn't matter so much to him, the specifics. And I think that kind of not being required to do things well, that sort of lack of pressure so far in Anthony Pettis' career may have been one of the defining factors in this fight, because Pettis has never been a fighter who has been pressured by an opponent like Rafael Dos Anjos. He's also been a guy who's had such a striking advantage over most of his opponents that he has not needed to really put a lot of thought into his positions. He can just kind of have his way. And we can also bring into that discussion the size of the octagon, which is 750 square feet, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. 32 feet 32 feet diameter. It's huge. And so it's kind of an outfighter's dream. A boxer who's used to being in the 400 or so square feet of a boxing ring, of like a 20-foot boxing ring, would love to be in the octagon. All that space, the corners are these little dinky, obtuse things. There's no way to get trapped. There just isn't for a boxer. But for an MMA fighter, you don't even have to develop the small motor skills of a boxer, because you have all this room to move. There's no pressure on you to really refine those aspects of your game. And so I think that those kinds of things really became clear when we watched Pettis finally under pressure and realize that the small details that really hold a fighter's game together may not actually be there. The glue is kind of missing.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I think, I think you're absolutely right about that. The thing that got me was the lack of a sense of urgency in Pettis wanting to get off the fence. Do you know what I mean? He never, and this was true of the first round of the Melendez fight too. I disagree with you to a certain extent when you said, well, he'd never really been pressured like that. I think Melendez really got after him with the pressure.
Yes.
But Melendez was executing a game plan. He wasn't fighting to type.
Yes.
I think that there's a fundamental difference between Melendez and Dos Anjos there, that Dos Anjos wants to be pressing forward constantly.
And if you watch that Melendez fight, is it really too surprising that Pettis doesn't have a sense of urgency, because so far in his career, Pettis has learned, with almost 100% accuracy, that his strikes are powerful enough and precise enough to stop people eventually. So even if they back him into the cage, eventually he's going to stop them. He's had that sort of Anderson Silva mystique of just, always being so dangerous. And you almost get that sense in his corner as well. Even if you were to go to Fight Pass, for example, and watch the Pettis versus Melendez fight with the corner audio, they're not really worried when Melendez is pressuring him. They seem very confident that he's going to hit Melendez with something that changes his mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that moment just never came in this fight.
It didn't.
Like and I think it was funny, Connor. You and I were talking about this before we started recording, but we both identified the exact same two moments where essentially Dos Anjos won himself the fight and Pettis lost himself the fight. And they're as much mental as they are physical. So it wasn't that big left hand that Dos Anjos landed with about 50 seconds into the fight. I think it was at about the 4:10 mark of the first round that damaged Pettis' eye. It was about 45 seconds after that. Dos Anjos backs Pettis up to the cage. Pettis throws I think it was a high kick, and then when Dos Anjos backs off just a step, Pettis follows up with a flying knee that lands absolutely flush. It was a perfect strike. Dos Anjos' back is to the camera, so we can't see his facial expression, but you see him shake his head. I imagine he smiled.
He shrugs and shakes his head.
Yeah, and you can see Pettis' face just fall. You can see the dismay on Pettis' face, where it's like, oh, this guy just ate my very best shot, a flush flying knee, which, in case you've never been hit with one, is the hardest strike that you can possibly get hit with. I mean that seriously. There is no more forceful shot that you can eat than a flying knee. If you can shrug that off, you sir are a man, or just. Actually, not to be gender biased, you are a bad son of a bitch.
I think that's a good way of saying
it. Or daughter of a bitch. I don't know.
Joanna Jędrzejczyk also strikes me as the kind of person who would walk through a flying knee if she felt like it.
Exactly. And it just must have been tremendously demoralizing for Pettis. And in fact, it was, because you can see this universal expression of dismay on his face after this happens, where Dos Anjos took his best shot, shrugged it off, and then immediately hit him again.
Yeah.
Immediately hit him. And then... Was it in the second round, Connor, the other incident that we discussed?
I think it was in the second or maybe the third round, where Pettis actually adapted a little bit, started trying to move the opposite direction, and tried to circle away from Dos Anjos' left hand. He started to find a little bit of success with his boxing. And we got to say this. When he's comfortable, Pettis is not a bad boxer. When he feels good and when he's having his fight his way, he's a pretty good boxer. He's gotten a lot better. But it was the pressure that changed these things and the mental cracks started to show more than the technical ones. And when he was starting to kind of find his groove, he hit Dos Anjos. I don't know if it was with do you recall what the strike was that caused?
I believe it was 2 straight body kicks. And speaking to your point about moving the opposite direction, those were the 2 times he actually got dominant angles. He got his lead foot outside and just cracked his shin right across Dos Anjos' midsection. 2
clean body kicks in a row. And maybe there's something at Cordero's gym that causes this because Dos Anjos did exactly what Fabricio Verdum did when Travis Brown successfully hit him with a kick. He dropped both hands and looked at Pettis like he was disappointed. Like his effort was not even good enough. Like, oh, you hit me clean, and that's what it felt like? And it's just, I think that this show is a technical analysis show, and so much of fighting comes down to skill. I think any trainer worth their salt will probably tell you that skill is one of the most important aspects of fighting, but that mental fortitude and the ability to understand and then manipulate the mentality of your opponent, to manipulate their emotions, not just getting in their head with trash talk, but fighting in such a way that you take away their feeling that they can beat you. That is really, I think, the highest peak. That's the pinnacle of successful combat sports. That's the pinnacle of martial arts. And Dos Anjos did it beautifully. I think by the end of the fight, Pettis really felt like he couldn't win. I think that's why, Pettis said after the fight that he couldn't see out of his eye the entire time. And obviously we don't know how true that was or not. I'm inclined to believe that his vision was certainly obscured because the first 2 left hands he got hit with, one was a thumb to the eye and the second one looked like it landed smack clean on his orbital. But it wasn't until the 5th round that Anthony Pettis said to Duke Roufus, I can't see. Because by the 5th round, Pettis, I think, had lost his confidence in his ability to win. Duke Rufus, by that point, was finally saying to him, you've got to go out there, you've got to get the knockout. And I think it was too late for Pettis to hear that, because I think Dos Anjos had already convinced him that he was going to lose. And that's, I mean, when you can do that to somebody, you have thoroughly won a fight in every way possible.
Yeah, well, you know, one of the things that we talked about at great length last week was how outfighters have to, in order to be successful, they have to pick their spots to exchange to stop a guy who's coming at them by disincentivizing them. You have to hit them hard enough to make them think that they can't just get away with walking you down and hitting you. You know, and Pettis in the past has done that very successfully. Pettis did that to Gilbert Melendez. Every time Melendez was on him, Pettis cracked him, and eventually, finally, he caught him with something that led directly to the guillotine finish. He never fully disincentivized Melendez, but he did eventually put him in a position to make a mistake that ended the fight. Now, Pettis tried to do exactly the same thing to Dos Anjos, and again, when we're talking about disincentivizing, this comes back to the mental aspect. It's not a physical thing. It's not that you're going to knock that guy out necessarily, but you just need to make them subconsciously think that this is so unpleasant that it stops them.
And it's not even about the specific techniques at play. It's not about when he hits you with the left kick, hit him with your right kick or something like that. It's not about what counters what. It's about countering. It's just about, you know, it's not about how you respond. It's about responding. You have to respond. And that was like Pettis normally does that. And instead it ended up being Dos Anjos who was doing that to Pettis. Every time Pettis would try to push Dos Anjos back and get his space, Dos Anjos hit him in return. He did not let Pettis get anything off without paying him back. And ultimately Pettis felt like it wasn't even worth the risk to try. And I mean, speaking of disincentivizing, speaking of dissuading someone from attacking, Joanna Jędrzejczyk did the exact same thing with her takedown defense against Carla Esparza. She made the prospect of ending up in the clinch with her a very, very unpleasant one by not only stuffing Joanna's takedowns, but making sure to hit her before breaking the clinch every single time. Every time they were tied up, elbow to the temple, knee to the body, a couple short punches, something, just to make her feel like every time you try to take me down, I'm going to make you hurt.
Yeah, and to come back to Pettis's exchanges, to Pettis in the exchanges real quick, like Pettis clearly had the right idea. He knew what he was going to do, right? Like he knew that Dos Anjos was going to come in, he was going to throw the left hand, Pettis was going to slip to the right, come back with the right, and then that would be it. Then Pettis could move, or he could throw something else. He could create space and get back to his game. That was clearly his idea of how those exchanges were going to go. Every time Pettis threw that right hand, though, Dos Anjos was right back with either a left kick or another left hand. Like, Dos Anjos never let Pettis be the one to finish the exchange.
Yes.
Dos Anjos was always the one closing the door. So you can think of exchanges in terms of layers, right? That you have the initial shot that opens the initial salvo that opens the exchange. You have the response, then you have maybe another response. In boxing and kickboxing, these exchanges can go 8, 10, 12, 15 layers deep. In MMA, you're lucky if you get an exchange that's 3 or 4 layers, simply because you have so many more options at the ranges where exchanges take place. You get more clinch entries, you get takedown attempts, you have more space in the cage, you get more movement. All of these things conspire to make exchanges relatively shorter in MMA. In this fight, what we saw was, like, Dos Anjos never let the exchanges end at 2 layers. They were always 3, 4, 5 layers. And when he baited Pettis into going beyond 2 or 3 layers, that was when Dos Anjos had his greatest success, was when he could force Pettis to throw something where Pettis wasn't comfortable. You know, that's not like Pettis is down to do that, but he isn't that good at it. And his defense is not there. And so something that I really wanted to talk about was defense in those exchanges, to come back to something that we talked about at great length last week, which is the fact that, frankly, Anthony Pettis is not a great defensive fighter. He relies almost entirely on angles and movement and not being in the spot that you're throwing to, far more than having a second layer of defense, you know, head movement, parries. Like, he moved his head fairly well in this fight, but it was not terribly slick. He was not Anderson Silva.
No, and his feet often were in the right position to make it happen. That, like, all of the defense, it's almost like there wasn't a layered defense. There were some layers, but they weren't connected. The pieces weren't working together, because, like, if I want to slip your jab and counter you, I don't just have to slip it, I also have to slip it and be ready to kind of pivot to my right so I can get the angle from my counter right hand and to get away from your right hand while I throw it. And then I have to step in with the right as I'm throwing it so that my head moves out of the path of your counter, and then I come back with my left. Like, the footwork and the angles and the head movement, they have to come together, and they don't really for Pettis. And I think what you said about Dos Anjos hitting him first and hitting him last is a really, really good point. I think it was Tyson Fury's trainer, Peter Fury, who said that when he fought Christian Hammer. I think he very specifically said, hit him first and hit him last. Always be the one to get off first, which Pettis or Dos Anjos didn't always successfully do, but tried to do and did pretty well throughout the fight. And even if you're not the one who gets off first, always be the last one to throw something in the exchange, because it doesn't matter what the judges think is happening or whether you're really winning. It makes the other guy feel like he's constantly in danger, which is something Pettis normally does to his opponents. And go on.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, that's all.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that something that we talked about before we went on the air here. Pettis, like the Rufus guys in general, and Pettis in particular, I think they make the perfect the enemy of the good, and nowhere does that more clearly show up than did this more clearly show up than in the exchanges. Like Rufus's guys in general, and I think Pettis is the absolute type specimen for this, are constantly looking to land that shot that's going to end the fight. And when they're thinking in terms of defense, they're thinking in terms of not getting hit at all, rather than how do I not get hit in the worst possible fashion, and how do I land a good shot, which would be the other side of that. Not every shot has to finish the fight. Not every defensive move has to be one where you completely don't get hit. And in the exchanges, Rafael Dos Anjos was happy to take the good instead of the perfect, and that's how he won the fight. Yes. It wasn't that Dos Anjos didn't get hit. He did. It's just that he didn't get hit cleanly all that much. A lot of the shots that Pettis hit him with in those exchanges bounced off his glove first. They bounced off his forearm first. He was doing some really interesting things with like a cross-armed guard in those exchanges, where it was just enough to deflect the shot. It's not that he didn't get hit.
Or he'd land to the left and then raise the elbow to bring the shoulder in the path of the counter right, stuff like that. Little subtle things. But it was also, I think it's really important to say that Pettis is too concerned with getting the perfect shot, too concerned with not being hit at all. And the real key of Dos Anjos' success was making the best of the times that he did get hit, which of course necessitates that you acknowledge the fact that you will be hit. So when Dos Anjos got hit, he went back to his corner. Cordero was like, perfect round. You know what I mean? He had a close first round with Pettis. It was close. And he went back, and Cordero said to him, perfect round. You did everything perfectly. Keep that pressure on, because eventually what you just did is going to keep working. He didn't care that Dos Anjos took a few shots, because they knew Dos Anjos would take a few shots. That was part of the game plan. The game plan accounted for what to do when you get hit. Whereas Pettis' game plan seemed to account for, yes, he's going to pressure you, but we're just going to be better. And it doesn't always work like that. Yeah,
you have to be able to accept the fact that the other guy is good enough to hurt you. That seems to be...
You're not fighting an idiot, as Luis Monda is fond of saying. Don't train as if you're going to fight an idiot. Train as if you're going to fight somebody who's better than you.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the real beautiful things about Rafael Cordero as a trainer is that he seems to get that on such a fundamental level. But that's part of the reason why he doesn't want his fighters worrying about the other guy. Like, they accept it as a given that the other guy is going to be able to do stuff to them. But that's why Cordero really does not want his guys thinking about what the other guy is going to do. He's like, let me worry about that. You just worry about what you can control and what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And you could hear that very clearly. I thought it was interesting that you raised that point about what Cordero said when Dos Anjos got back to the corner after the first round. You did that perfect. He's all about building up your confidence and making you believe in yourself and believe in what you're doing, whereas that is very much not what we heard from Duke Roufus in the corner.
No. And I mean, is it any surprise that Dos Anjos, how much of a fighter's chin is his willingness to take a shot? I think that is something that people really don't realize. They say, this guy doesn't have the chin. Almost always, somebody who has a great chin is somebody who gets hurt and responds well to it, rather than somebody who just doesn't feel the impact of the blow or doesn't get dazed in the first place. And so with Dos Anjos, with that kind of confidence building in his corner, and with the way that he fights being one of just constantly building momentum, crescendoing, feeling more and more confident as you find bits of success, is it any surprise that he could eat a flush flying knee from Pettis and just shrug it off? Because he knew in his head, whether or not this is actually 100% true, Dos Anjos fought as if he knew that Pettis could not hurt him. Not that Pettis couldn't hit him, but that it didn't matter if he did.
Yep. Yeah, and that was very much, I think, the dynamic of the fight. I mean, all credit to Rafael Dos Anjos for being just a rawhide tough dude. He's only been knocked out once in his career. This was his 31st professional fight. He's been knocked out exactly one time, and that was by just a right hand of doom from Jeremy Stevens in his UFC debut like 7 years ago.
The flying knee of uppercuts.
Yeah, it was just one of the most vicious, like, slow motion shots you've ever seen in your life. That's what it took to put Rafael Dos Anjos down. Yeah. And so, I think there's just kind of real quick as we wrap up this section on this fight, there's an argument to be made here about durability, just sheer durability, being one of the most important components for success at a high level. Because if you look at what Robbie Lawler and Rafael Dos Anjos, and to a certain extent Vitor Belfort too, all have in common, it's that they're tremendously durable dudes.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Belfort less than Lawler and Dos Anjos, but
I think that's true. And that Stephen Wright, who we've had on the show before, striking coach at Team Takedown, led Johnny Hendricks to a very resounding success on Saturday. Stephen said the same thing to me on Twitter right after this fight. He said that Dos Anjos had to be able to take Pettis' shots. He had to have a good enough chin to do it. And he's absolutely right. The athlete, at a certain point, the athlete just physically has to be good enough to make the game plan work. But I also think there's something to be said for bolstering the athlete's mentality to make up for any deficiencies, to disguise them, or even make it so the athlete doesn't realize he has those flaws, make him feel like he's doing things perfectly. And I think that Rafael Cordeiro has really gotten that down. And when you look at guys who take a tremendous shot, guys who are they just seem unstoppable, and some of them even get better after they get knocked down. They're also guys who take body shots really well, and I can tell you that nobody has an iron liver. You know what I mean? Nobody has an iron liver. What you have is an iron will. And so when Marcos Maidana was dropped by Amir Khan's liver shot and got back up and chased Amir Khan around the ring for 11 more rounds, that wasn't because he takes a shot well. That was because he refused to lose. And I think that Dos Anjos has a great chin, a titanium chin, in fact, but I think he also has the mentality to shrug off shots literally and mentally as well, to just shake it off and keep going.
That is an excellent point. I had actually forgotten that he literally does have a titanium chin because Clay Guida broke his jaw and they had to get a plate in there.
Yes.
I had actually forgotten about that. Unfair advantage, yay or nay.
Dos Anjos has actually bragged in the past about how he has broken fighters' hands with his new bionic chin. But if I recall correctly, a doctor came out and said, actually, that titanium plate is only millimeters large. It's not actually enough to do damage. But who's to say? Maybe he was just protecting his secret research into creating unstoppable Brazilian jiu-jitsu kickboxing warriors like Dos Anjos.
Yeah, that is potentially true.
The experiment has succeeded.
And again, to come back to what we were talking about, if Dos Anjos actually believes that he can't be hurt because he has a titanium plate in his chin,
that's great.
Who's to say that that's not true?
Yeah, maybe like he had a really smart doctor, or Cordero slipped the doctor $100 bill and said, hey, tell him this will make it impossible for him to be knocked out. Because that's how he fights.
Look, having talked to Rafael a couple of times, that would not at all surprise me. This is a guy who's still down to just throw soccer kicks in sparring sessions when you yell pride rules. That's okay. You could do that. Actual thing that happened at Kings with Vanderlei Silva last year.
Oh, fun times. Okay, well, we're going to take one more break, everybody. After this, we'll come back. We may have a few more words to say on Pettis versus Dos Anjos, but we have to get into the absolute domination from Joanna Jędrzejczyk over former strawweight champion Carla Esparza that happened in the co-main event of UFC 185. Quite possibly the most dominant championship performance ever. And so we'll be talking about that after this. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. And we are back. A couple more words on Pettis versus Dos Anjos, then we're going to move on to Jędrzejczyk versus Esparza. Pat, you and I were just saying how badly Pettis seemed to shift between striking and grappling. How easy it was for Dos Anjos, who, while a strong wrestler, is not, he's not Khabib Nurmagomedov, certainly. We saw that in their fight. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Pettis doesn't have the... We've talked a lot about the relationship between mentality and skills. Mm-hmm. And so at a certain point, I think that Dos Anjos came into this fight with the mentality to improve his skill set. The mentality backed up his skills. And at a certain point, I think that Pettis usually does the same, but when the mentality failed him, when he started to break, it turned out that he actually didn't have all the skills needed to back it up and get his confidence back either. Mm-hmm. And so when it came down to it, at a certain point, and I will be writing about this, by the way, in my article extensively. For people who are annoyed that I tend to repeat myself, it's because when Pat and I come on here and break down fights, it's just things that I've been thinking about leading up to the recording of the show anyway, and things that I try to expand on in different ways in multiple formats. But if this comes out Wednesday morning, then you will have read about this yesterday on bloodyelbow.com. I think that at a certain point, an infighter has to take space away from his opponent rather than constantly try to make space. Because even in the vastness of the UFC octagon, you can't back up forever. I take a backward step, you take a forward step. That is that's a game that I will always lose. Because eventually I'll run out of room and you'll be close enough to me to hit me. And Pettis seemed so concerned with constantly doing everything in his power to create that last inch of space and just get that much farther away from Dos Anjos that he off-balanced himself, he put himself out of position, he was too worried about what was coming his way to take the strikes away, whereas I think we would have seen that Pettis is a much better wrestler than he appeared had he, for example, stood his ground at one point, stepped into Dos Anjos, clinched and turned him and got back to center of the octagon. I don't think it was that he was necessarily such a terrible wrestler or even such a bad phase shifter. I think he didn't have any confidence in his ability or what hadn't been trained to just take that space away from Dos Anjos. At a certain point, you giving the other guy space is working against you.
Well, I mean, to your point, Ben Askren told Pettis exactly that in the corner, I want to say between the second and the third round. He says, Askren said something to the effect of, when he steps in, I need you to lock up with him and get chest to chest and turn him.
Absolutely.
I think that was. I think that's almost the exact quote that Askren
I got to go
gave
find
him.
that quote because it sounds like Askren knows what he's about.
Yeah, I think that was the exact quote that Askren gave him, and Pettis seemed to be so sucked in to Dos Anjos' rhythm. To come back to the topic of rhythm, something we've talked about a very great deal over the last couple of months here. Mm-hmm. Pettis just seemed to get so sucked into the rhythm of exchanging that when Dos Anjos shot, he had no idea how to respond because he was already throwing the counter to the shots that he thought were going to be coming.
Yeah, or blocking the punches he thought were going to be coming, or what have you. Too ready for the strikes to really react effectively.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jędrzejczyk, Esparza. I think we've basically talked Anthony Pettis to pieces. Hopefully we'll see him back soon. Still a fun fighter to watch. Still one of the best lightweights in the world.
Yeah. I mean, one kind of final note for me on that. I think that Pettis is fine. Pettis is not suddenly like a trash fighter.
Oh, yeah.
like this is something I've seen floating around a surprising amount in the last few days, that like, well, if Dos Anjos could do this to him, everybody can. And it's like, no, this was the product of Dos Anjos being a bad stylistic matchup, being a rawhide tough son of a bitch, and having the power and the speed and the athleticism and the durability to make that game plan work.
Yeah, people have tried to pressure Pettis before. I think that's why we picked against Dos Anjos last week. You know, we've seen, maybe we didn't account for how good of a pressure fighter Dos Anjos is, but Melendez certainly tried, and Ben Henderson certainly tried. Neither of those guys are as good or as natural pressure fighters as Rafael Dos Anjos is. But it's not as if Pettis can't deal with pressure. Pettis has some good tools to adapt to his opponent when they are giving him trouble with pressure. He did that to Cerrone, he did it to Melendez, and he did it to Henderson. But I mean, Rafael Dos Anjos executed perfectly. I mean, I have no criticisms of how Dos Anjos, even with him getting hit and doing some things technically wrong or whatever, from a strategy perspective, it was a perfect fight. Everything went as it should.
It was a perfect game plan executed by the right fighter at the right time.
Absolutely.
Does that about sum it up?
And that's absolutely true. Yeah, although I will say, if Rafael Dos Anjos and Khabib Nurmagomedov now become the top two guys in the division, can Pettis ever get back to the lightweight title?
Two really defined pressure fighters against a guy who is allergic to pressure, as executed by really fast, athletic, strong, powerful wrestlers.
Yeah, two men who can no doubt out-grapple him and basically take away every ace up the sleeve that Pettis has.
Yeah.
Tough call.
That's tough.
Maybe it's time for featherweight. Maybe Aldo will move up to lightweight now, and Pettis can make his run at the featherweight throne. But as I said, let's move on. The co-main event, women's strawweight title. Joanna Jędrzejczyk came in, another fighter whom we picked against. We thought Esparza was going to be too good for her, and I mean, Jędrzejczyk fought so well as to make us look stupid. She absolutely took Carla Esparza apart, and it was in many ways similar to the main event. It was Jędrzejczyk's not as much a pressure fighter as Dos Anjos is, but she's a boxer puncher who pressures well, and she did it very, very admirably against Esparza. I'll let you give your thoughts in a minute, Pat, but to me, I mentioned this earlier, the most defining aspect of this fight early was the disincentivizing plan employed by Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I think the fact that she made Esparza pay for every takedown attempt, that she just basically took a bite out of her every time she went in for that attack, was the key aspect. Not necessarily that she was a better wrestler, and I think it was clear very early that she was not. When Esparza was doing well, even doing okay on the feet, and getting in on her takedowns, she got Jędrzejczyk down. She would have won if it was a wrestling match. But the fact that Jędrzejczyk hurt her every time, and particularly with that one Matt Brown-esque slapping elbow that knocked Esparza silly and sent her reeling into the fence, that's kind of the exact game plan for a striker to beat a wrestler, is to wrestle just well enough to hurt them. And she did it, once again, perfect execution.
Yeah, we kind of, in terms of the overall meta game of mixed martial arts, we kind of slide back and forth between strikers and wrestlers at various points. And every time the evolution slides back and forth on this continuum as to who has the advantage, new wrinkles emerge. And right now we're at a point in the meta game where it's swinging back towards strikers who know how to defend takedowns. And the reason why is precisely this disincentivizing aspect that we're talking about here. Because there was a point where, okay, well, strikers who learn how to sprawl. Okay, well, now the advantage is in favor of the sprawl and brawlers. And then we got really good chain wrestlers who were able to once they were in on your hips, a simple sprawl wasn't enough. You had to be able to do other things. Then we got, okay, well, now the strikers have learned to defend against chain wrestling, and okay, now the strikers have a little edge again. And then, well, okay, then we got wrestlers who knew how to phase shift. Then we got the prime Georges St. Pierre, who would draw your attention up high and slide under with takedowns as you were worried about defending those strikes. But now we're back at this point where strikers are learning not just to stuff takedowns, but also to hurt you while you're doing it, to make you not want to shoot them in the first place.
Yeah.
And so what Jędrzejczyk is doing here puts her on exactly the cutting edge of where the metagame of mixed martial arts is at this point, because Esparza is very much a representative of this like beautiful phase shifting kind of approach to wrestling and MMA. She chain wrestles really well. She's got great drive once she's in on your hips. She generally speaking does a good job of disguising her strikes with takedowns and vice versa, disguising her takedowns with strikes. Like all of these things play together really neatly. How did Jędrzejczyk just short circuit that? By just beating the crap out of her every time she came in. Every time there were elbows, there were knees, there were, every time they broke the clinch, Jędrzejczyk was swinging at her, whether she landed or not.
Yeah, I think the battle of wills is the one thing that defines both this and the main event. Mm-hmm. And you can see so clearly. People have been saying that Rafael dos Anjos must be on performance enhancing drugs because of his performance. And while I'm not denying that he is, I at this point I just prefer to expect that everyone's on drugs and just not care. But the fact is that people have been saying that because dos Anjos was tireless and he kept such a pace. Well, if you really watch the fight, dos Anjos gets tired after the second round. Mm-hmm. His body's not working the same way. His strikes don't have the same pop. He's not bouncing around on his feet anymore. He's not feinting so aggressively. He's conserving his energy for the big attacks.
He starts blocking or deflecting more punches instead of moving his head quite as much.
Yes,
head movement is tiring, especially as you're moving forward and pressuring. It takes energy.
Absolutely. It's weight shifting and moving your weight from one leg to the other. It just takes too much energy to be worth it. At a certain point, you get too tired. But the difference is that dos Anjos was confident throughout the fight. Dos Anjos felt like he had enough energy to do what was needed, and Pettis at a certain point did not. And the same thing played out in this fight. Esparza, just like Pettis is wrestling, Esparza's striking is not as bad as it looked in this fight. She struck competitively with Rose Namajunas. She's done well on the feet against many opponents. She's only ever lost to strikers in competitive split decisions. So the fact that Jędrzejczyk was able to make her look like an amateur who didn't even know how to block punches is a testament to how effective this deterrent strategy is, how effective it is to make someone feel like they can't do it. Because if you feel like you can't do it, you're almost always right. And that Esparza just completely lost steam. Also Esparza was exhausted after 2 minutes. She was tired. And it wasn't because she was working so hard or because she's not in good shape. She's a tremendous athlete. She's been wrestling for a long time. She still wrestles with collegiate wrestlers. She's very athletic. She didn't have the confidence to feel like she had energy. She was too tense and too nervous to spend that energy wisely. And all of the credit for that goes to Jędrzejczyk.
Yeah, there's an argument hiding in here, I think, in both of these fights, and it's not something that we really talked about a lot with regard to dos Anjos, but Jędrzejczyk is a real hitter. She really packs like big power in her shots, and I have to take this opportunity to apologize because I made a joke on Twitter when Joe Rogan said Joanna Jędrzejczyk is a world-class striker, and I don't say that lightly. To which my response was, Joe Rogan says that all the time. It's
literally every card.
Yeah, it's like Joe Rogan says using the term lightly. That's not directed at Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I don't want anybody to think that I was insulting Joanna Jędrzejczyk.
She is a world-class striker.
She is a legit world-class striker. She spent time with Ernesto Hust. She's clearly worked under really good coaches in Poland. She's fought legit high-level women strikers above her weight class, well above her weight class. And
I've got to be honest, this is almost never the case, but I think Jędrzejczyk has improved her striking since coming to MMA. I think she's continued to get better, at least in terms of boxing. We haven't, obviously she's not confident yet enough in her kicking to go to the kicks, which she used a lot more in Muay Thai, but she's gotten better with her hands since coming to MMA, not worse. She hasn't lost a step because of the threat of takedowns.
Yeah, the person to beat Joanna Jędrzejczyk is going to suck her into a striking match, and then when she's busy striking with you, then you're going to be taking her down. You can't just go out and straight up wrestle her and expect to win, because she's so long, she's so strong, and she hits so hard like that. Again, to come back to the point that I was making before I digressed, and with my apology here, Jędrzejczyk hits really, really fucking hard, and so does Rafael dos Anjos. And like when you hit like that, if you're not used to being hit like that, and when you look at Anthony Pettis does not train with dudes who are real hitters. He trains with a lot of people who kick really hard. He trains with some really competent strikers, but Pettis doesn't train with dudes who are just knock your block off punchers.
Yeah.
And neither does Carla Esparza. Esparza trains with people like Ian McCall, who's not like pillow fisted or anything like that.
He's not a knockout artist.
Yeah, or Tiffany Van Soest, who's a very strong Muay Thai fighter. She's very, very good, but she's not really a puncher either, you know?
Yeah.
And when Joanna Jędrzejczyk puts hands on you, you know it. Like, I outweigh Joanna Jędrzejczyk by damn near 100 pounds, and I'm willing to bet that if she hit me with a flush liver shot, I would be going down immediately. Yeah. You know? Like, that's not... Like, I mean, I'm not trying to insult myself or anything. I just genuinely think that she is a puncher regardless of gender or weight. Like, she just has that kind of power. And she's got perfect mechanics, too. You see the way that she throws everything. She gets her weight behind all of her shots.
And there's something to be said for cultivating a training environment in which your fighters are prepared to face that kind of opponent. It's not just about finding sparring partners who match your opponents technically. You have to, as a trainer... I think at a certain point, you've got to put somebody in there who's going to try to beat your fighters up, who's going to let them realize, you know, in stages, not just to get them thrashed in the gym, but let them realize in stages that they can survive something like that, that it's not the end of the world. Because, Pat, I don't know if you recall, but let's say do you recall the first time when you went to a Muay Thai gym and you got hit with a knee to the body?
Oh yeah, it's the most unpleasant experience.
And it's like the first time it happens, I think this probably happens to everybody except the hardest of hard asses, where you get hit with that first hard body shot or the first really stunning punch to the jaw, like a clean punch that you just start to see flashing lights and everything, and you knocks your head back and you go stumbling. And you have a second where you think, I can't do this. I actually am not as capable of being a fighter as I thought I was. Like, even in gym sparring, I don't know if I can do this. Mm-hmm. And then the more that happens, like, you take shots now, years into training, that would have made you cry when you first began. You have to cultivate an environment in which your fighters get used to getting hit. And it was pretty clear that Esparza, I mean, she was shocked by how hard Jędrzejczyk was hitting her, and I think Pettis was too. I think they were both stunned because they've never had anybody punish them like that. And being in the gym is not about being punished, but it is absolutely about learning to take punishment the right way.
Yeah, I think that really applies most to shots to the body and shots to the legs. Like, the first time you get kicked by a legit Dutch kickboxer, the first time you get low kicked by one of those people, you know, you're limping. I swear to God, you go and you do this if you've never done this before. If you get low kicks by a legit Dutch style kickboxer, you're going to feel it for about 4 or 5 days.
Yeah,
just one kick.
And then you watch the way these guys trade kicks in their fights, and they're walking around and jumping up and down in celebration. It's not just physical conditioning. There is an aspect of that, but it's just knowing you can take it. Mm-hmm. You got to know you can take it.
And body shots are just like that. But when it comes to headshots, it's not just the initial shock of getting hit. When you get hit by a real puncher, by a real hitter, when you take that shot to the dome, you feel yourself move with the shot, like involuntarily. Like, not like you're trying to absorb the shot or something. Like, your whole body moves when they hit you. And this, you could see this happen with when Sergey Kovalev fought Jean Pascal this last Saturday in a really excellent, really entertaining fight. You could see Kovalev's shots move Pascal around the ring involuntarily. Yeah.
Like, his head would move first, and he'd have to move his body to catch up with it, so his head stayed on his shoulders.
And you could see that the way that Jędrzejczyk was hitting Esparza, too.
Yeah.
That those shots physically moved her from place to place involuntarily in a way that she did not want to be moved. But that's real power. That's the combination of having that natural ability plus the mechanics that allow you to do that consistently without gassing yourself out.
Yeah. Hell of a performance. Great night of fights all together.
Shall we introduce our new preferred nickname for Joanna Jędrzejczyk?
Oh, yeah. What did we decide on? Was it Lady Golovkin?
I think Lady Golovkin is it.
Eastern European, funny, broken English, very charming and lovable, and shit your pants terrifying.
Yep.
Just like Golovkin.
Just scary as balls. Just scary as anything you've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can go with it. Lady Golovkin, Pretty Tony P, Ill Dill for TJ Dillashaw. I love being in the nickname creation business.
I mean, I think we're going to have to stick with this.
Oh, I think so. I love it. Although, is it sexist? Should we call Golovkin
Lady.
I don't really want to have to say Mr. Jędrzejczyk. I don't want to have to say Jędrzejczyk any more than I already do.
Yeah, that's the whole reason we're doing this, for God's sake. so that we, now that we can just call her Joanna Champion or JJ or Lady Golovkin. I mean, just any of those, so that we can just quit with this.
This goddamn name. Let's streamline the process.
I can't remember who it was on Saturday during the fights who tweeted. It may have been Ben Folks or it may have been Jordan Breen or somebody who said, "You can almost hear Goldberg powering himself up every time he says Jędrzejczyk," and you could hear the relief at the like when Jędrzejczyk left and they were starting the Pettis Dos Anjos promo packages. Like you could hear the relief that was the last time he was going to have to say it that night.
Like now all I have to deal with is the familiar R as H and how do we pronounce the J question of Rafael dos Anjos. We're used to that problem. These Polish names are a new and terrifying test for the commentators.
And to their credit, I mean, we criticize a lot in this business, but I think we got to give a shout out to Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg, who really did a pretty damn good job on Saturday.
Yeah, they seemed. I mean, most of all, I think those guys are best when they're enthusiastic. Mm-hmm. And they were into the fights, which I can't fault them because it was a good night of fights. And so, yeah, I thought they did a perfectly fine job. I didn't have any problems with it. Other people were saying it was one of their worst performances. I did not agree. I thought they did it doesn't matter if you don't have a technical nuance if you're at the very least appreciating what's happening. And they were definitely doing that. Articles this week, Pat, what to look out for? We have a horrendous fight card coming up in UFC Fight Night Maia versus LaFleur. Are you doing a preview of that? And the
preview will be out Wednesday or Thursday. It is a terrible card. I highly recommend, if you're going to sit down and watch tape to preview it, I recommend a strong beverage. Our good friend of the show, Sean Sheehan, who writes for Severe MMA in Ireland, recommended, I believe, paint thinner as the beverage of choice. So that should tell you a lot about the quality of the card, as should the fact that we did not discuss a single fight coming up on that card.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm writing any articles about it.
Yeah. Other than that, I've got a top 10 article on brutal beatings coming out on SureDog, and then for my radio show, the MMA Rounds, I did interviews with a few very fine strikers. Andre Feely of Team Alpha Male, who's fighting this weekend. Then also Joe Schilling and Nikki Holtzkin, who ended that interview by saying, "quote I love you." What do you got coming this week, Connor?
Well, my life is empty now that I know Nikki Holtzkin has picked you over me. So, but I'm going to soldier on. It'll probably end up being a two-parter. That the second part of which will come out right after this episode is released on BloodyElbow.com. And that'll be my breakdown of Rafael dos Anjos' amazing win over Anthony Pettis. I'm going to talk about in technical detail a lot of the things we discussed more broadly today. Then I think I've got a technique recap coming. I want to talk about Beneil Dariush. I want to talk about Germaine de Randamie. I want to talk about Joanna Jędrzejczyk and all of the amazing striking we had on this entire card. And then for the weekend, I haven't really decided yet. I don't know. Not the UFC card is not Inspire, but Pacquiao Mayweather things are taking up time now. So look for some Pacquiao versus Mayweather videos from me soon. Other than that, don't really know. Social media, everybody, you can find us on social media. On Twitter, I'm at BoxingBush. Pat, your Twitter handle?
I'm at Patrick_Wyman.
And if you have questions for us, please send them to our Twitter handles. If you just want to talk us, compliment us on the show, please do the same. And if you have those questions that you want read on air, make sure to tag them #HeavyBagQuestions. Longer questions and suggestions or requests, what have you, can be sent to Connor at HeavyHandsPodcast.com. That domain, HeavyHandsPodcast.com, is where you can find this, as well as all of our previous episodes and a big depository of all the articles I've ever written. Those articles have been published mostly on BloodyElbow.com, where from now on you can find this podcast. Boy, all those segues in one sentence. I'm proud of myself.
Well played, sir.
Thank you so much, Pat. Thank you. You know what, Pat? I love you. Thanks for coming on the show today. I had a blast talking about these.
You too, Connor.
I had a blast talking about these fights. If you came here today, everybody, for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands, and we love you. All right.